I am Beth. Yes, I am from the IPMSDL and YIPIN. So, for everyone's information, this webinar is being recorded and this will be uploaded to different social media platforms. So, uh, you can turn off your video if you're not comfortable being recorded. Thank you everyone for joining and thank you for everyone who is introducing themselves in the chat. So yes, we encourage everyone to introduce yourselves and where you coming from, what country are you from, and what organizations are you from in the chat box so we can all get to know each other. All right, so good afternoon everyone. I am Beda Wao from the IPMSDL and the Asia Young Indigenous Peoples Network, and I will be your facilitator for today's webinar, Reclaiming Pro-Planet, Pro-People Pathways. It's an online discussion on hydropower, greenwashing, and Indigenous peoples' right to development. So we are gathered today in line with the International Day of Action for Rivers to reflect on the impact of hydropower projects on Indigenous peoples, our communities, and our ecosystems. While many large dams are presented as green and sustainable, Indigenous peoples continue to experience displacement, environmental destruction, and violations of our rights. So today's discussion aims to unmask hydropower greenwashing and affirm genuine people-led and people-centered alternatives to development. So we will begin. For our first speaker is Shadishkanta Takchenchang, a human rights advocate from Manipur, Northeast India, and Secretary of the Youth Forum for Protection of Human Rights. His work focuses on Indigenous people's rights, environmental justice, climate change, and the impacts of large development projects on vulnerable communities. He is also part of the Council of Leaders of the Asia Young Indigenous Peoples Network. Okay, so go ahead, Shadish.
Okay. Kurumzari everyone, and good afternoon everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the topic, unmasking the role of international financial institutions in destroying river system. Though I am not an expert, but as an indigenous youth leader, it is my privilege to share my thoughts on this topic. And it is also an important conversation, especially for indigenous communities whose lives and livelihoods are deeply connected to rivers and natural ecosystems. For indigenous communities, rivers are not simply bodies of water and water sources flowing through landscape. Rivers are living systems. They sustain our livelihoods, food system, culture, spirituality, and ecological balance. They sustain our livelihood, food system, culture, and ecological balance. For generations, communities and indigenous communities have depended on these rivers for fishing, agriculture, livelihood, drinking water, and domestic uses and traditional practices that shape their identities and ways of life. For indigenous communities, especially in Asia, it is very crucial for the rivers to be protected. However, in the name of development, many rivers across the world are being transformed into sites of large infrastructure projects, particularly mega dams. International financial institutions or IFIs such as World Bank, Asian Development Bank, JICA, African Development Bank, European Development Bank, and International Finance Corporation play a crucial and central role in financing these large-scale projects. In 2024 alone, multilateral development banks collectively committed nearly 19.6 billion US dollar for water and related infrastructure worldwide. Hydropower dams continue to be a major component of this investment by this IFI. Historically, the World Bank has financed more than 600 large dams globally since the 1950s. These dams are often presented as solutions for clean energy, green growth, and climate mitigation. Government and financial institutions argued that hydropower is a renewable energy source that can support the global transition away from fossil fuels. However, from our experience as an indigenous community and the realities we experience from the ground, a very different stories emerge. Large hydropower project results in massive ecological destruction, displacement of indigenous communities, and militarization of project area, criminalization of community that resist the dam project, and in many places, defending rivers and ancestral land has become increasingly dangerous. Civil society groups around the world argue that large dams often represent a top-down model of development where the benefits are concentrated among corporation, industry, and urban center, while the environmental and social costs are borne by indigenous community that are dependent on that rivers. Dear Rajas, next slide, please. There rises a serious question that why these IFI promote dams despite they are having many negative impacts on the communities dependent on rivers. Several narratives are often used to justify this project, especially the first is the narrative of green energy transition. The hydropower is categorized as renewable energy within global climate financing frameworks. Because of this classification, large dam projects are able to access climate funds and development financing. The second is the narrative of infrastructure-led development. Dams are presented as necessary for electricity generation, irrigation, flood control, and national economic growth. However, in reality, many megadams primarily generate electricity for export and for industrial zones, mining operation and export market, rather than for communities directly affected by this project. In Manipur, many of the mega dams like Mapitel, Kruga dams fail to meet their purpose and to generate electricity after being destroyed large-scale areas of forest land, agriculture area, and displacement of indigenous community by this development project like Mapitel Dam and Kruga Dam project. If mountains are flattened, forest summers and community displaced in this process, we should ask ourselves, is this truly sustainable development or is this really a sustainable development for the people and for the communities? And by this IFI promote dams, in reality it is a cycle of debt dependency and policy conditionalities set up by the corporate, like the government take loans from the International Financial Institute, and the cycle is like that. In order to pay the debt for the past loan taken by the government, the new project is emerged to pay that debt. That is like cycle, like debt dependency to the corporate. And also the policy and legislation are passed by the government without due consultation with the indigenous community and without pre-prior information of the communities. Like the policy is making like policy conditionality to meet the needs of the corporate, like the IFI and many multinational corporation MNC. And next slide, please. And there's a huge role of neo-colonial regime in facilitating dam construction. In many cases, government act as a intermediaries for international capitals, agreement with international lenders and private corporations. Ancestral land and rivers are open for large-scale infrastructure development, often without the genuine participation or consent of the business community. In conflict-affected regions, militarization and counter-insurgency operations are frequently used to clear the way of this project. like military force is set up around the project area, that makes the communities who belong to area affected by project are not allowed to come inside project area due to the huge military uh, deployment in that area. And also in the name of counterinsurgency, like in the state of in the region of Northeast India, there are many counterinsurgency operations conducted in the name of behind the development project. And in such narrative are used to delegitimize indigenous struggle for land rights, environmental protection, and self-determination of the indigenous community. And let me briefly highlight a few case studies from Asia and some other parts of the world that illustrate this pattern. Like we can recall the Bujagali hydropower plant funded by International Monetary Fund and World Bank that have destroyed the important Bushu cultural and spiritual site. And this mainly this Bujagali hydropower plant makes the privatize the electricity of the region, and it makes the cost to the common people to pay higher of the electricity. That is the negative impact of this Bujagali hydropower plant. And next slide. And in the northeastern region of India, it was also funded by World Bank. That is the project name is the Northeastern Region Power System Improvement Project, and is the World Bank gave a loan of 470 million US dollar to the Indian government to improve electricity supply interstate. That the World Bank financed high voltage power transmission line crisscross the Barak, Irang, and other important rivers of Manipur and adjoining state. And it will be this project facilitate the construction of many dams across the northeast region, and in Manipur there are so many proposed dams like in the Barak River and in Brahmaputra River, and in Manipur in Tipaipu dam is also proposed, but still is not commission and is not started, but it's many small and large mega dams is proposed in Manipur, despite being many mega dams like Pichel Dam, Kugar multi-purpose project dam are still lying defunct, and also Lokta Hydro power project is also lying defunct that cannot produce enough electricity, and Mapitel Dam cannot produce enough electricity as they just provide some water to the city area only. So this have many negative impact to the indigenous community living in Manipur and to the neighboring state. Next slide, please. And one of the example in Philippines is Jalur River Multipurpose Project 2 in the Philippines. This project is also financed by Korean Export-Import Bank with an amount of 410 million US dollar as a loan, and with also funding from Philippines government. The project titled to displace Tumando business community, flood ancestral land, and damage the ecological balance of the river system. The project has also witnessed militarization and the red tagging of anti-dam activists. In a tragic incident known as Tumando massacre, where 9 indigenous leaders opposing the dam were killed during the police operation. And there are so many examples of negative impact of dam funded by RFI in Myanmar also. For example, dam project in Salween River in Myanmar is one of the last remaining free-flowing rivers in Asia. The rivers support rich biodiversity and sustain the livelihoods of more than 10 million people across China, Myanmar, and Thailand. However, the river faces threats from at least 20 proposed hydropower dams. Like in Manipur, we have more than 20 proposed dams, and including the Hedji Dam. Communities in the region, particularly Karen indigenous communities, have raised serious concern about displacement, militarization, and the destruction of fisheries and cultural landscape. And one more example is Turian hydroelectric project in Mizoram, built on the Turian River with financial assistance linked to Asian Development Bank, have also many negative impacts to the communities of Mizoram. Another example is the proposed Lower Kopili hydroelectric project in Assam on the Kopili River with cooperation linked to institutions such as Japan International Cooperation Agency. And one more example is in Sikkim, the Tista River has been transformed into a cascade of dams, including the Tista Fat Dam with financing linked to institutions such as International Financial Corporation, the World Bank, private sector. One of the World Bank's private sector arm is International Finance Corporation, and Germany's KfW Development Project. Another major proposal is Siang Upper Multipurpose Project on the Siang River in Arunachal Pradesh, which could become one of the largest dams in India. If constructed, will have many negative impact to the environment and to the communities living along the Siang River. When we connected this example from Philippines to Myanmar and Northeast India, we begin to see a broader global pattern. Rivers are increasingly treated as sources of energy and economic profit rather than living ecosystems that sustain communities and biodiversity. Large dams in Northeast India and around the world have caused significant impacts on indigenous community and present ecosystem. They often lead to displacement, submergence of forests and ancestral land, disruption of river ecosystem, and loss of traditional livelihood. Beyond environmental damage, this project also threatens indigenous rights, culture, and community control over their natural resources. We must also uphold the rights of indigenous peoples, including the principle of free, prior, and informed consent before any developmental project is carried out in the indigenous people's land. Rivers are not merely economic resources. They are lifelines for communities, biodiversity, and future generations. Protecting rivers is therefore not only an environmental responsibility, it is also a struggle for justice, dignity, and survival in this community. With these few words, thank you everyone for listening to my speech, and please bear my English as English is not my first language. So thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you so much, Shadish. It is very important that everyone, that we all know that these development projects are backed by the IFIs and that many hydropower dams are tied to ecological destruction, indigenous displacement, militarization, and neo-colonial control. So thank you again for showing through concrete case studies how these projects operate in different contexts but produce the same pattern of harm. For our next input, our next speaker is Beverly Longid, a Bontoc Kankanay activist and longtime leader in the Indigenous Peoples Movement. She is a co-convener of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, a national convener of Katribu, and chairperson of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. She has decades of experience in Indigenous peoples activism, environmental campaigns, and advancing the right to just development. She will be speaking on the topic Indigenous Peoples' Perspective Towards Genuine Sustainable Energy Projects and People-Led Development.
Gawis ay agaw kanda ko amin. Warmest greetings to all. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak on the perspective of indigenous peoples to development. So today I will speak from the perspective of indigenous peoples whose lands, cultures, and livelihoods continue to be threatened by projects, programs, and policies imposed upon us in the name of development. So for indigenous peoples, what governments and corporations often described as development frequently means something very different on the ground. It means the plunder of our lands, the destruction of our ecosystems, and the displacement of our communities. These experiences are not isolated. They are rooted in a global system shaped by colonialism, neoliberal globalization, and imperialism, which continue to treat indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and waters as sources of raw materials, as sources of energy, and as sources of profit. Today, I will share several perspectives from indigenous peoples on why this dominant model must change, why imperialism must be dismantled, and why respect for indigenous peoples' rights and leadership is essential to achieving a truly just and sustainable future. One, the dominant model, as I've mentioned, is rooted in colonialism, neoliberal globalization, and imperialism. This prevailing model, presented as development, is not people-centered. It is a model of plunder. It is a model of suffering. It is a model of destruction. Historically, colonial powers seized indigenous peoples' lands and resources to enrich imperial economies. Today, this pattern continues through neoliberal globalization, where multinational corporations gain access to minerals, forests, water, and energy resources in indigenous peoples' territories. These operations are only driven by profit. In this system, indigenous territories become frontiers for extraction, while indigenous peoples bear the environmental and social costs. Communities are displaced to serve global markets. And when indigenous peoples resist these destructive projects, governments often respond not with dialogue but with repression. In many countries, including the Philippines, indigenous communities and leaders defending their lands face militarization, red tagging, harassment, and surveillance. We are subjected to strategic lawsuits against public participation or SLAP cases intended to silence legitimate opposition. Indigenous human rights defenders are criminalized, threatened, and in many cases even killed. These responses show that the current system protects corporate and elite interests rather than the rights and welfare of indigenous peoples. Two, the current global crisis deepened the pressure on indigenous peoples. The current global situation is further intensifying these pressures. Geopolitical conflicts and wars driven by imperialist interests are worsening the global economic crisis. The escalation of tensions and wars instigated by United States and the war instigated by United States and Israel against Iran shows how imperialist conflicts can destabilize economies and deepen global insecurity. These wars not only bring military destruction, they also cause great economic suffering for people around the world. Imperialist wars disrupt food and energy systems, drive up the prices of fuel and basic commodities, and worsen hunger, food shortages, and poverty, especially in countries already facing economic hardship. This US-led war increases energy prices, disrupts supply chains, and diverts public resources meant for education, health, and other social services toward military spending rather than social services, food security, and social protection. For indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities, these global crises often translate into a more aggressive resource extraction as states and corporations search for new sources of minerals, energy, and land to feed war economies and global markets. In times of crisis, indigenous territories are increasingly targeted for mining, energy projects, plantations, and infrastructure that serve foreign markets. Thus, the global conflict and economic crisis are not distant events for us indigenous peoples. They directly intensify pressure on our lands and communities and exacerbate, worsen the economic hardships our people face. Number 3, indigenous peoples are not against development or national progress, and we will not get tired of saying this. Indigenous peoples are often accused of being anti-development whenever we oppose destructive projects. But this is a false narrative. Indigenous peoples, like any other oppressed peoples around the world, want development and progress, not only for our communities, but also for our compatriots, for the whole country. However, development must not serve foreign corporations and their local cohorts at the expense of our lands, at the expense of our rights, and at the expense of our environment. Development must benefit the people. Ecosystems that sustain life. We oppose plunder disguised as development, but we support initiatives that genuinely improve community well-being, protect nature, and respect human rights. For indigenous peoples, progress must be equitable, it must be sustainable, and it must be people-centered, because protecting our lands and asserting our rights does not mean rejecting progress. It means ensuring that progress does not come at the cost of destruction. Number 4, land rights and self-determination are foundations for just progress. For indigenous peoples, recognition of ancestral land rights and self-determination is fundamental. It is non-negotiable. Land is not merely a commodity or an economic asset. It is the foundation of our culture, identity, spirituality, and survival. When ancestral land rights are respected, indigenous peoples are able to sustain livelihoods, protect biodiversity, and maintain cultural systems that have been preserved, ecosystems for generations. Equally important is the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights to free prior informed consent, or FPIC. FPIC ensures that indigenous peoples have the right to decide whether the projects take place in our lands and territories. This means that initiatives or any project affecting our lands must not be imposed. They must be decided with genuine participation and consent of indigenous communities. When these rights are respected, initiatives are more responsive to community needs, they are culturally appropriate, and less likely to lead to conflict and environmental damage. Number 5, indigenous leadership strengthens sustainable initiatives. Indigenous people's participation and leadership strengthen sustainable initiatives. Our knowledge systems, developed over generations of stewardship, contribute to sustainable resource management and biodiversity conservation. One clear example is the emergence of people-led renewable energy initiatives. Across the Philippines, indigenous communities and people's organizations have developed community-based micro hydropower systems and other genuinely renewable energy solutions. These initiatives show that even the poorest communities can lead projects that provide energy access while protecting ecosystems and respecting ancestral land rights. Similar initiatives are growing globally through collaborations such as the Rights Energy Partnership with indigenous peoples, and some of the examples include, solar powered systems in indigenous communities in Cambodia, solar energy installations in Cameroon, energy initiatives in indigenous peoples communities in the Congo, solar electrification projects in El Salvador, renewable technologies in Tharo communities in Nepal, and other system supporting indigenous communities or peasant communities or rural communities. These initiatives demonstrate that indigenous peoples are not only defending our lands, we are also creating and enhancing solutions for sustainable and people-centered progress. Number 6, last but not the least, the need for solidarity and collective action. Finally, indigenous peoples recognize that the struggle for justice and sustainability cannot be carried out by indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations alone. The forces driving environmental destruction, economic inequality, and militarization affect many sectors of society. Workers, peasant, fisher folks, women, youth, and other marginalized communities also face exploitation and displacement under the same system, controlled and dominated by imperialism. That is why solidarity and collective actions are essential. Indigenous peoples must strengthen alliances with other oppressed and exploited sectors, social movements, and civil society organizations. Together, we can challenge systems of imperialist exploitation, defend our rights, and build alternatives that prioritize people, communities, and the environment. Only through collective action can we transform the structures that continue to drive plunder and inequality. In closing, the dominant model imposed on indigenous peoples today prioritizes extraction, imperialist interests, and corporate profit over people and the planet. Indigenous peoples continue to resist this model of plunder and destruction. At the same time, we continue to advance alternatives grounded in land rights, self-determination, community leadership, and ecological stewardship. Indigenous peoples want progress that benefit our communities and contributes to the well-being or development of our countries, but not progress that serves foreign capital and destroys our environment. At this critical moment, when imperialist wars are escalating and global crises are deepening, we must also raise our voices against wars that sacrifice people and nations for geopolitical domination and profit. It is a war not of our making, and imperialist countries like the United States should not drag us into this war. Imperialist wars bring devastation to communities, divert resources away from social needs, and intensify the exploitation of lands and peoples across the world. Indigenous peoples must stand for peace, for justice, and the defense of life. So we call on people everywhere to unite in opposing imperialist wars and systems of exploitation that threaten our collective future. Let us strengthen our solidarity across borders, movements and communities, because the struggles of indigenous peoples to defend our lands is also a struggle to defend humanity's shared future. Another world is not only possible, it is necessary. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity to present some ideas on development, and a pleasant day to all of you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Beverly. Another world is not only possible but also necessary. I agree with that very much. Again, you really help it make clear that indigenous peoples are not anti-development. What we oppose are destructive projects, destructive war, and all forms of violence that violate our rights and devastate our communities. And what we continue to assert is development that is rooted in our land rights, self-determination, peace, and the real needs of our people. So thank you so much, Beverly. We now move on to the reactor portion of our program. We are honored to be joined by two reactors who will help deepen today's discussion. Our first reactor is Tanya Lee Roberts Davis, Policy Director of Rivers and Rights. For over 20 years, she has worked with civil society groups and social movements on labor, women's, environmental, climate, energy, resource, and water justice issues across Canada, the Philippines, Thailand, and Palestine. She holds a Master of Laws in International Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and a Master's of Arts in International Human Rights Law. And our second reactor is Iggy Sandrino of Ibon International. Iggy is a writer and researcher focusing on policies and campaigns for sustainable and people-led industrial policy while challenging export-oriented and extractive economic models imposed by institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. So to begin the reactor portion, let us first hear from Tanya Lee Roberts Davis.
Thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this critical conversation. As Beverly mentioned, in this moment of incredible intensification of aggressive wars and militarization, as well as pressures on civil society and social movements across the world. So first of all, I just want to also extend and express my solidarity to colleagues and comrades joining us today and who will be listening in later, who are mobilizing in and with communities confronted by the development of hydropower dams as well as other large-scale extractive projects. And really to also emphasize that we have heard through these two different presentations the specifics of the levels of dispossession and the environmental devastation and the reality that hydropower dams, as well as similar other types of extractive projects, are not solutions to the climate crisis. They're not solutions to energy concerns, and they're not solutions which will be for the future that will enable a rights-based just transition. And instead, we've heard how there are alternative ways forward that emphasize the realities of and bring forward the realities of local communities and assert the right to self-determination and to land rights and to water and resource rights, as well as to gender justice and social justice, and really asserting the right to give free, prior, and informed consent, but also to say no when projects are being imposed. I also just want to raise the fact that we know, as was mentioned in the first presentation, that the World Bank, as well as other international financial institutions, continue to finance hydropower dams, despite the resistance that has been ongoing for decades. And we see that, for example, that they continue to also sort of evade accountability by financing technical assistance as well as financing associated facilities such as the electricity grids and the surrounding infrastructure for dams. And in this case, it really also is important to recognize that in the upcoming months, in October, there is the World Bank annual meeting coming up, and it does present an opportunity for us to mobilize around in the lead up as well as during, to have people's actions, both in person and online. And perhaps I'll just close by saying that I hope to see all of you there during the mobilizations at that time. And then over to you, Iggy.
All right, thank you so much, Tanya, for those important reflections. Now let us also hear from our second reactor, Iggy Sandrina of Ibon International.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having Ibon International here on the 29th year of the International Day of Action for Rivers. We also extend our unconditional solidarity to all the Indigenous peoples who are fighting for their rights to self-determination and genuine development. For more than 80 years since the founding of the IMF and World Bank, the institution continues to promote structures of maldevelopment for many countries, especially in the global south. We also continue to see growing debt burdens hampering genuine development. In 2025, global debt accumulation hit a record $348 trillion, with debt ratios reaching above 235% of GDP. Mostly in developing countries. This simply means that peoples in developing countries continue to be deprived of sovereignty over their economies as governments spend more on debt repayments than in social welfare and actual productive investments. Loans, especially from international financial institutions, risk reinforcing ultra-dependence and foreign capital accumulation in the South. This has been the case for most countries in our region where we have a shared history of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, which has created dependent economies specifically designed to answer the interests of northern states and corporations. While global foreign direct investments we've seen a decline in the previous years, developing countries continue to see a marginal increase. This uncertain and volatile landscape continues to favor short-term private investments that prioritize profit repatriation and quick gains to the detriment of more vulnerable economies. Now, the World Bank has endeavored to build infrastructure, policies, and business climates for resource plunder and exploitation. Programs under the Green Revolution, for example, throughout the 60s up to the 80s, were responsible for agricultural models which we are all familiar with, like monocropping, the use of pesticides, and the export-oriented agriculture, which destroyed peasant livelihoods and the environment. Now, mega dam projects in the Narmada River, for example, in India, the Chico River in the Philippines, the Chicxoy Dam in Guatemala, and more recently in the Bisri Dam in Lebanon, led to massive human rights violations and the violation of indigenous people's rights. As the largest shareholder in the IMF and World Bank, the US exercises a dominant role with over 16% of voting shares. Throughout history, loan conditionalities have largely aligned with US interests. The US under Trump has undertaken an America First policy, which simply means openly continuing what the US has been doing on an intensified scale. Yet this hardly means leaving other nations alone, as US Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent asserts, and I quote, "Far from stepping back, America first seeks to expand US leadership in international institutions like the IMF and World Bank." And this occurs as the US exits more than 60 multilateral institutions under the UN, most of which are related to climate change and development aid, issues that greatly impact peasant and indigenous peoples. World Bank President Ajay Banga also sits on the executive board of the Trump-created Gaza Board of Peace, which seeks the reconstructions of Gaza into a commercial zone. The World Bank's collusion with the warmongering government that has brought devastation to Palestine, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, and other anti-imperialist states is a neo-colonial act that seeks to profit from the destruction of sovereign nations. Wages have stagnated, farmers have been dispossessed of their lands, indigenous peoples continue to face the multifaceted threats of militarism, climate change, and the plunder of ancestral domains. All these occur amid crises that IFIs have a hand in creating. Now, reclaiming pro-planet, pro-people pathways means reclaiming economic sovereignty. This paves the way for self-determination and lays the foundations of an industrial policy architecture that is people-led instead of foreign-dictated. Calling to shut down the IMF World Bank means acknowledging and putting an end to the decades-long international financing system that has only hollowed out the global south. Comrades, neoliberal orthodoxy is eroding and multilateralism is in crisis. The situation presents both challenges and openings to structural transformation. Working peoples and movements are fighting to advance national industrialization, genuine agrarian reform, and the right to self-determination, to decide development initiatives based on context, strategies, and industrial and agricultural transformation to set the path towards economic sovereignty and self-reliance. Delinking from the exploitative stranglehold of the IMF World Bank means creating more room for Southern cooperation and people-to-people solidarity. This also means rejecting imperialist debt and austerity, militarism, and genocide. Ultimately, those most affected, us, the workers and peasants, the indigenous peoples, and all oppressed peoples must come together, like what Ms. Beverly have mentioned. Truly protecting our rivers, our livelihood, and communities requires shutting down the IMF World Bank in the long term and establishing a sovereign economy that serves the interests of the people. And I end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iggy, for that meaningful reaction and for providing additional context on the IMF and World Bank. And thank you once again for all our speakers and reactors for their valuable inputs. So we now open the floor for the question and answer portion of our program. For everyone who has questions, you may send your question through the chat box or raise your hands if you would like to speak. Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you are not speaking, please keep your microphone muted. And if you would like to speak, kindly wait to be acknowledged first before unmuting. So there are already some questions in the chat box. I will read them. Hold on. So for the questions, I would like to ask our speakers and our reactors to answer them. So for the first question, Elias Kimayo, they said, "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elias Kimayo from an indigenous community known as Sengwer in Kenya." Yeah. So and I'm so thankful for the convener of this meeting related to what we're going through at the moment in Mbubut Forest, where government has proposed to construct a multi-purpose dam without FPIC from Sengwer. So what does this mean? Is more escalation force? Oh, okay. I thought this is a question. I'm sorry. But what does this mean? Is more escalation forceful evictions of Sengwer from their home in Mbubut? Forest, not only that, their culture and livelihoods. Okay, Elias, you can unmute yourself.
Certainly. I see Elias just in case, but if not, I can go ahead.
Okay.
So, Elias, are you? Oh no, I cannot hear you. Okay, so if I may very quickly, I'm Alankay Morales, and I'm a Brunca indigenous person from, yeah, I'm Brunca indigenous person from Costa Rica. And I just wanted to stand in solidarity with all of you in relation to the cases and the situations that were presented. And very quickly, just to mention that at the Business and Human Rights Center, we provide support to cases where there are allegations of human rights violations in the context of business activities. And currently, there is a very strong focus in our work around the just energy transition, given the multiple areas that are affecting Indigenous peoples along that renewable energy value chain, right? All the way from the development of the renewable energy projects to the extraction of transition minerals and the overlaps that there are with Indigenous peoples around the world. And just to say that if at some point any of you requires support on something, we have like some mechanisms such as what we call the corporate response mechanism, which is an accountability mechanism in place that we can reach out to companies based on public allegations around a specific situation that may be happening in a country, just so that, or in a specific community, so that they know that there is international scrutiny around this. And we can also provide connections with other organizations that are supporting, let's say, through OECD, national contact points, among other things. So happy to help and stand in solidarity, and I'll share my details with all of you. And back to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Kai, for that. Yeah, please share your details in the chat box. Yes, we cannot hear you. So, I will read another question in the chat box. So, from Princess Luna, hello everyone. I'm Princess from the Philippines, and my question for Mr. Shadish: do you think the international financial institutions like the World Bank should change their policies regarding large dam projects, and if so, how? Shadish?
Thank you, Princess, for your question. But I have some written suggestion on your question, like if the World Bank need to changes their policy, they need to focus more on like the rights-based approach, like pre-parent informed consent need to be mandatory, and like they should shift their focus from financing large dam to community-based water management system, or some uh, uh, environmentally friendly or sustainable project that can benefit both the indigenous community or local communities, that communities, and can also be benefit to the state. But not but they should change their interest from that last dam to community based project. So they also have strict. They can also have amend or put some safeguard policy. They already have safeguard policy like environment and social safeguard policy, but they need to amend or make changes, like strong rebound cells to be there, including they can include the indigenous people in the monitoring committee, or like that, so that indigenous people can engage directly to the World Bank, so that to make the policy indigenous people's friendly, or local communities friendly, so they can do like that. It's just my simple suggestion.
Okay. If Iggy and Tanya wants to answer, he can also respond.
Sure, I'll go ahead, and then Iggy, if you want to as well. I guess I thank you for the question as well. I mean, I do think that it is possible to continue to advocate for the World Bank and other IFIs to not finance destructive dams, whether they are smaller or larger. We know that they are destructive and that they can have massive implications upstream and downstream. And we know that pressure has worked to try to end their financing directly of coal projects and other types of projects. So it is possible to mobilize I think also what is important to recognize is that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was so much pressure leveraged on the World Bank, including through the launching of the World Commission on Dams, that the World Bank actually didn't finance dams directly for several years. And now that it seems like there is this push around so-called just transition and shifting away from fossil fuels, dams are coming up as an excuse to continue to finance. And so I do think it is possible to continue our collective pressure and to get them out of financing of dams and associated infrastructure.
Yeah.
I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Tanya. Iggy?
Yeah. The position has always been that the IMF and the World Bank is not salvageable. We only have 80 years of maldevelopment uh, as proof that even if the World Bank and the IMF change their guidelines in implementing these infrastructures, you know, a lot of nations have only been buried more in debt, and those are increasingly becoming more impossible to get out of precisely because of the loan conditionalities that come with them. That's one. Another is that if we do not acknowledge the power dynamics that play into the implementation of these infrastructures where militarization comes in, where land grabbing comes in, which the IMF and the World Bank do not recognize, then changing policies, changing guidelines do not really do anything in terms of, pushing for genuine development for affected communities and peoples.
All right. Thank you so much, Iggy, for that answer. We have a few more questions I received through personal message. Um, so one is IFIs often post themselves as pro-planet by issuing supposed environmental and human rights guidelines when handling out loans or financing development projects. Are these actually effective safeguards? If not, what are cases we can cite that prove these guidelines as mere beautification efforts of IFIs? So the three of you can answer as well. Shadish.
Yes. Though they possess themselves as a pro-planet by adopting environmental and social safeguard policy, but in reality, on how we experience it or how we witnesses it, in many cases, their safeguard demand largely like in paperwork only, and their implementation is weak, and even though there is many several policy and complaint, their project continues. Uh, Even though there is serious violation of their guidelines. For example, in Zalu River multipurpose project, like I also shared in the previous session, like Tumandog indigenous communities were displaced from their ancestral land, and there's also bloody Tumandog massacre by killing 9 indigenous leaders for their resistance against that project. This is the clear example of how their safeguard policy is lying only in the paper. And coming to Manipur also. It is not, even though it is not directly funded by IFI, but through their arms or like co-funding or like Mapitel Dam project, many of the upstream and downstream people affected areas are uh, worstly affected by the dam, like summer central forest area, agricultural area, and sources and spiritual and and traditional places which are connected to the uh, ancestral land. And also in the downstream, many of the people lost their livelihood before this dam is commissioned. People are rely their livelihood on collecting sands and stone by not using excavators and all. Now it comes like privatization by deploying many excavator by many elite people, and now the rivers get polluted, worstly polluted. The day before yesterday on International Rivers Day, we also went to the downstream area and we witnessed that the riverbed is badly destroyed and river water is badly vastly polluted and contaminated by this private stone crusher company and all. And many people also die during this dam project during the before the commission and after the commission of this dam in Manipur also. Like all your safeguard and environmental and social policy are lying and exist only on paper. So in my opinion, that their safeguard policy is not fully comply by themselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Shadish. Does Tanya and Iggy wants to answer, or can I move on to the next question?
Maybe just quickly, a couple of points. One is just that I think maybe in terms of short term, the actual policies of the banks, even though they are systematically violated, it is important, or it is one way for communities that are affected by dams that are financed by the World Bank to look to those standards and to leverage them, but knowing that they are consistently violated. And I think just in terms of examples, we've also seen how the IFIs consistently are now moving forward in terms of even financing mining and other large-scale extractive projects in conflict zones, and that's very clear that their standards are not being adhered to. And that would be short term, but I think longer term, like Iggy mentioned, is that the solution is that we need to have alternative institutions that are people centered, that are human rights centered, and work towards the long term dismantling of these institutions that advance the neocolonial and capitalist and neoliberal policies of those in power currently.
All right, thank you, Tanya. Does Iggy wants? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll refer to my colleagues for the specific case studies. Many were mentioned a while ago, but again, our experiences tell a different story, a different narrative from the supposed environmental and human rights guidelines that these IFIs conjure. Yes, we can continue to engage in the spaces where these guidelines are drafted, but the more important task is to confront on the ground how these guidelines are implemented.
All right, thank you so much. We have another question. So, hold on. For the next question, how can we realize independent, self-reliant economies and do away with debt dependency? How can we do this while looking after the welfare of our environment? So anyone from our actor and speakers can answer.
Maybe I can go first this time.
Okay.
Yeah, Beverly's presentation a while ago, the last slide was a very significant example of how we can do this because um, The people-led and IP-led initiatives are not simply isolated initiatives for self-sustenance. These are seeds for genuine development, which we need to nurture and replicate. So that's what we need to do. We need to um, reclaim our rivers because our rivers, through the dictates of IFIs, have become sources of wealth for corporations rather than, places for our homes, our livelihoods, our cultures. So there needs to be an emphasis on the need to advance national industrialization, genuine agrarian reform, and the indigenous people's right to self-determination as pillars of genuine development. Along with it is the reclaiming and shifting of power structures for it to shift towards the interests of the people.
Okay, Shadish, Tanya, do you want to go next?
All good. Agreed.
Okay. Shadish.
Yes, I want to add some point like for us, like indigenous people, this can only be possible if our people are liberated from discrimination and, most importantly, when our right to ancestral land is realized. And additionally, by strengthening our local economies, that, like for example, local agriculture, small-scale industry, and community-based enterprises that create livelihoods without destroying natural resources. And like one of the colleagues also mentioned, like we need to reclaim our rights of our national resources like forests, rivers. Like this, we can. These are the important requisites for us to able to control our own resources for us, the people to be able to hold power of industry and resources, and to do this with regard to environment and justice. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Shadish. So, are there any more questions? All right, so if there are no more questions or interventions, we will now close today's program. So, thank you, everyone. Thank you for all our speakers, reactors, and our participants for joining us in this important discussion. So, before we formally close, can we ask everyone who's comfortable to open their camera for a short picture taking? All right. So, our staff will do the pictures. Okay. All right. So, let's pose one. All right. Can we do one with our fist raised? All right. All right. Again, thank you, everyone. And um, we will post the highlights and these recording on our social media. Please follow us at IPMSDL and our global campaign against IMF World Bank and IUPIN as well. Thank you once again for your time, your presence, and your solidarity. All right, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.